Thank you, everybody. So, just to catch you up, I'm Dulcie. I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society. We are here for How It's Going, How It Started, a 5-part event series. This is number 2 in the 5 series. So How It's Going, How It Started grew out of a program at Washington State University called Roots of Contemporary Issues, which is a course that all freshmen take. And I had the privilege of being a teaching assistant in this course many moons ago. And ever since, I have wanted to see a program series like this as an educational program for the general public. So last year, 5 of the teachers, the instructors in the RCI program published works with Oxford University Press, and we are actually going to have all 5 of the authors join us in this speaker series. Last month, we had Karen Phoenix speaking to us about gender and imperialism, and tonight I am very grateful to have Dr. Clif Stratton with us. I do want to thank, before we get going any farther, the really awesome staff and volunteers here at the Kenworthy Performing Arts Center, our local theater, and all around great place. So big shout out to the Kenworthy. Also, thank you very much to the Idaho Humanities Council, which provided funding for this program series. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Stratton. Clif Stratton teaches global and American history at Washington State University. His research and teaching interests span the histories of colonialism, racism, energy, immigration, urban expansion, and sport. He's the author of Education for Empire, American Schools, Race, and the Paths of Good Citizenship, and Power Politics, Carbon Energy, and Historical Perspective, which is what he'll be referencing this evening. I'm going to join us.
On the screen, share search term that won't go away. Is that on your end?
No, it's not on my
Okay, because I don't see it on here. So
Okay.
it's just us here in the theater.
Okay. Do this. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can you confirm that they can see me on Zoom? Good? Okay. Oh, there I am. Okay. All right. Thanks everybody for being here, both in person and online. The title of my talk tonight, as Dulcie said, is based on my most recent book, Power Politics. And tonight, I'd like to spend a little time at the outset of this with a series of events that date back to about July of this year. So this is the here's how it's going part, and we'll get to the where it started in a bit, how it started. All right, let me make sure I've got a rhythm here. Slide advance, just space bar. Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Oh, thank
Yeah.
you. Okay. All right. The image you see here is from July 19th, 2021. 7 women were arrested while protesting the construction of Enbridge Energy's Line 3 replacement pipeline. This is in northern Minnesota. Kelly Miracle, age 57, member of the Tonawanda, Seneca, and Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, Honor the Earth Executive Director Winona LaDuke, and 4 others were chained themselves at the right-of-way crossing the Shell River in northern Wadena County, Minnesota. Police, whose salaries are paid by Enbridge Energy when they're engaged in counterinsurgency against pipeline protesters, arrested the women on trespass charges and jailed them for 2 nights. LaDuke spent a 3rd night in jail for previous resistance actions. On July 30th, several days later, police used pepper spray and rubber bullets on pipeline resistors, engaged in direct action again against the Line 3 pipeline. Jailed protesters reported mistreatment while in detention, including lack of proper food, solitary confinement, denial of medications. On August 5th, so we're moving closer to our present day, the White Earth Nation filed suit against Minnesota State Department of Natural Resources in tribal court, contending a water use permit for Line 3 puts wild rice at risk. It could be important for the larger rights of nature movement. August 25th, let me get my slide going here. There we go. Hundreds gathered outside the Minnesota Capitol as part of a week of events protesting Line 3, which is set to carry tar sands oil from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada to Superior, Wisconsin, traversing 1,097 miles in total and crossing through some of Minnesota's most ecologically sensitive wetlands, lakes, and rivers. The pipeline is set to begin delivering oil by December 2021, though just the other day, the company announced that it was, quote, operational. I'm not quite sure what that means. Crosses the Mississippi River twice near the headwaters. August 28th, several dozen people protesting against Line 3 again were arrested outside the governor's residence in St. Paul. August 30th, Minnesota Court of Appeals affirmed a decision by state pollution regulators to issue a water quality certification for Line 3, dealing a legal blow to opponents of the project, including indigenous nations through whose territory the pipeline traverses. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency issued water crossing permits on November 12th, 2020, with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers issuing permits 3 days later. So those have been in legal limbo, and on August 30th, we're now a go for Enbridge Energy. This is from September 3rd. U.S. Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota's 5th and other members of the House known as the Squad went to northern Minnesota to highlight their opposition to Line 3 and renew calls for President Joe Biden and his administration to halt construction on the nearly completed Line 3 pipeline project. Quote, "We want this issue to be elevated and for it to become important enough for the president to take action as he has on the Keystone XL pipeline," Omar told reporters. October 11th, that was just this week, Indigenous Peoples Day. Indigenous-led protests outside the White House demanded, under the banner of People versus Fossil Fuels, that Joe Biden cancel Line 3 and take bold action, federal action, to combat climate change. Meanwhile, in northern Minnesota, as I mentioned a second ago, Enbridge proclaimed, despite lack of federal environmental review, that Line 3 is, quote, operational. A few weeks before, Enbridge also admitted that they had no insurance on Line 3. Insurance companies wouldn't touch the project. As StopLine3.org reports, since 2014, thousands of people have shown up at hearings, called on elected officials, and demonstrated peacefully to oppose Enbridge's Line 3 tar sands oil pipeline. Since construction began last year, more than 800 water protectors have been arrested. Legal challenges are pending by Friends of the Headwaters of the Mississippi River, the Sierra Club, Honor the Earth, the White Band of Ojibwe, the Red Lake Band of Chippewa Indians, the Youth Climate Interveners, and the state of Minnesota's own Department of Commerce, which projects the social costs of climate change to Minnesotans at $287 billion with a B. Despite the fact that his own Department of Commerce is party to these lawsuits, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has greenlit the project through the permitting process at every step. The party in these lawsuits have highlighted two interrelated issues at stake in this struggle over Line 3. And these are going to be issues that pertain to one of the historical examples that I'll talk about later. One is that the environmental impacts of oil transport and use, including its contributions to climate change, that's one. And the second is the violation of indigenous treaty rights in the permitting and construction process. In other words, pipelines are political, as evident in how water protectors and Enbridge present the basic geographic features of northern Minnesota. So I'm gonna put up a couple of maps next to each other here. The one on your left is Enbridge's map of the pipeline area through which the proposed pipeline would run. There's an existing pipeline there, then there's the replacement route. And then on the right, we've got stopline3.org's map of the pipeline route. You'll notice that Enbridge's map is a little light on the bodies of water that stand to be affected. There are some major ones represented there. And it seems that that Enbridge might wish that those bodies of water were sort of left out of the political discussion or equation. Okay. The battle over Line 3 is, of course, not the only one of its kind in recent years, and it's not the only one that is part of a web of oil pipeline infrastructure to export terminals and refineries throughout North America. I'm gonna put up another map here. Sorry, an image. I'll show you another map in just a second. At an estimated 1.6 trillion barrels of oil, Alberta's Athabasca oil sands, which I'll refer to as tar sands, comprise the world's largest reserve of recoverable heavy crude oil and third largest oil reserve overall behind Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. About 20% of the tar sands requires what's called surface mining rather than deep ground drilling, because the oil is mixed with sand, clay, and water really no more than about 70 meters below the surface of the earth. And this process, of course, involves deforestation, the raising of forests that sits atop the soil. The remaining 80% of recoverable reserves demand hydraulic fracturing or fracking, the same method used to extract gas. Both methods, both surface mining and hydraulic fracturing, use copious amounts of water, much of which ends up in toxic tailing ponds, both above ground and under, where the waste poisons aquifers. Global Forest Watch reported that from the year 2000 to the year 2013, tar sands mining resulted in the raising of about 700,075 hectares, or almost 3,000 square miles. If my calculations are correct, that's about 437 Moscows at about 6.85 square miles attributed to the city limits. May not be exact. Additional habitat destruction brings the total to an estimated 12.5 million hectares. So many, many more Moscows. And once extracted, tar sands oil is so heavy that it must be mixed with solvents in order to flow through the pipelines that take it to market. And if it spills, it sinks in the waterways, making it extraordinarily difficult to recover and clean up efforts. Of course, these tar sands are landlocked and are only profitable if the energy companies that are involved in their extraction can get it to market. And to this end, over the last decade, but even before, they proposed and begun to build a web of new replacement, but also new export pipelines running west to the Pacific, to British Columbia, for export to Asia, east to the provinces of Quebec and New Brunswick, where much of the Canadian population is, and south across terminals where US energy companies refine it, turn it into usable form. Put up that map. This is Canada's oil and natural gas. As you can see, it's really Canada and US oil and natural gas energy web. All right, in 2015, there were 4 major pipeline projects that really formed the nucleus of the tar sands export project. Northern Gateway, Enbridge, which was an Enbridge project, Energy East, which was a Trans-Canada project, Keystone XL, again, a Trans-Canada, and Trans Mountain, which was a Kinder Morgan. These are all names of energy companies. And the companies have sought state, provincial, national regulatory approval on both sides of the border to build and operate these pipelines. And they frequently attempted to use local and national governments' privilege of eminent domain, legal device used to strip property owners of their property in order to build infrastructure that in theory serves the public interest. This is like building a highway through your neighborhood by removing your house. You can use the highway, that's the public interest, if you can afford a car. This is where the economic interests of these energy companies, and there are dozens of them, and of course all of their investors, collide with the resistance of indigenous communities and their allies in both the US and Canada. So if we take Enbridge's Northern Gateway pipeline, for example, you can see it, it's a little blurry up here, guys, sorry. Hopefully those on Zoom can see a little clearer map. This is running out of Alberta. This one is running, I can even see that, west into British Columbia. This one, Northern Gateway, the company first announced in 2006. Regulatory process, but its National Energy Board is dominated by members who formerly worked in the oil and gas industry. So there's a bit of a revolving door situation where many of these projects are simply approved by the National Energy Board without any serious consideration, not only for environmental consequences, but for the rights of communities impacted by these projects. And many experts say that the best legal challenge in Canada to the expansion of the tar sands is actually with the Canadian Constitution, and in particular, something called Section 35, which was written in 1982 and requires both, quote, a duty to consult and if appropriate to accommodate the concerns of Indigenous people, end quote, in cases where their rights may be impacted by the government's action, including decisions to approve energy projects, including, but not limited to pipelines. This might also include power plants, hydroelectric dams, et cetera. Court challenges, though, are expensive, they're unpredictable, and in many cases, the Canadian government simply goes through the motions of consultation with Indigenous groups, but ignores the substance of their concerns with the reasonable expectation that a judge will say that the project can proceed anyway, having done the mandatory consult. So to that end, First Nations in Canada, their counterparts in the United States, are not simply relying on the legal system to save them from these projects. Instead, they are actively, as we've seen in these images earlier and in recent weeks and months, actively blocking pipeline construction as these resistors to Enbridge's Line 3 have recently demonstrated. I want to talk about one in particular that I've been talking with my students about for several years now, and in fact, just this week, it so happened that we were covering this topic and thinking about the Unisautin clan, which is part of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation in British Columbia. They're one of the leading edges of this pipeline resistance movement and have been for since at least 2008. They've been physically blockading no fewer than 10 pipeline projects crossing unceded Wet'suwet'en territory in British Columbia. They've created checkpoints for surveying crews and other contractors that work for the energy company. They tear out route markers. If they're found on hereditary lands, they build action camps, cabins, pit houses, permaculture gardens, other kinds of infrastructure directly in the lines, the GPS routes of these proposed pipelines. As one Untitled spokesperson, Frida Hewson, said, "I'm occupying our homeland," in hopes that the movement will inspire other Untitled to ways of living. She goes on to say, her husband, in fact, his name is Togastai, says, "We're asserting our rights on our lands and we're not breaking any laws. We're doing what our ancestors would have done." In the absence of favorable court rulings that kill pipeline projects, the Untitled resolve that their continued resistance will delay the pipelines long enough and cause financial investors to pull out, effectively killing the projects. And we've seen examples of this happen both in Canada and the US in recent years. By 2016, in fact, the Untitled had effectively killed the Northern Gateway pipeline project through blockades, causing delays, which caused investors to pull out. Conservative Member of Parliament Erin O'Toole recently in Canada has suggested that if elected Canadian Prime Minister, she would resurrect the ostensibly private pipeline project, private company. It's too bad she lost last month's snap election and won't be doing that. Similar actions in Eastern Canada and the United States have hampered and delayed construction on the Energy East, Dakota Access, and as we talked about earlier, Line 3 pipelines. Near the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota, an alliance organized and led by Lakota Sioux youth, calling themselves water protectors, swelled to form the Oseti-Sakowin camp in 2016 that blockaded the Dakota Access pipeline route. These protests were enough to pressure then US President Barack Obama, after much dithering, of course, to deny approval of the pipeline. This was not before, of course, North Dakota State Police and private security forces hired by the pipeline company attacked the water protectors with German shepherds and fire hoses, very reminiscent of 1960s Birmingham, Alabama, in attempts to maintain segregation and voter suppression. In keeping with the growing resistance, in 2017, members of Winona Ledukes Ojibwe, which I mentioned earlier, locked themselves to equipment to stop construction of Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline. As we see that in the way of pipeline routes. Okay, I want to stop there with how it's going and talk a little bit about how it started, shift gears, and think a little bit about some deeper historical examples. So I want to pose a question. What do we make of these efforts by Indigenous people and allies to stop flows of North American oil in the 21st century? On the one hand, we could see them, these more recent events, as unique, particularly given the sheer magnitude of the climate emergency. If the crisis is unprecedented, then their actions might be. Moreover, we could see the Untitled, the Ojibwe, the Lakota Sioux, the Mohawk, and others as the vanguard of this global climate justice movement that seeks to sweep away coal and oil in favor of renewables. And many see themselves that way too, and have said so in numerous interviews and at protests and rallies. But I would argue that while the climate crisis is unprecedented in its scale, Indigenous water protectors are firmly within historical traditions of political resistance to carbon-fueled industrial capitalism and colonialism. In other words, Indigenous people have long histories of such resistance, as do other groups, as we'll see here. With the time I have left this evening, I'd like to highlight two historical examples of resistance to the dominance of carbon energy corporations. The first is going to be briefer than the second, and will not focus primarily on environmental concerns, but rather issues of labor, health, safety, and democratic participation in the workplace. The second, as you will see, looks an awful lot like the indigenous struggles against pipelines that we've just been talking about. So let me start with the first, and it takes us to Colorado's southern coal fields in the 1910s. Network of company housing, stores, and schools that kept many coal workers and their families indebted to the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. Oh, see, I'm already behind on my slides. Apologies. This is Tent City or White City at Ludlow, Colorado. Paternalistic mining practices, mining death rates that reached twice the US national average came to a head in September of 1913, when fresh Colorado United Mine Workers recruits went on strike. The union funded and organized makeshift open housing beyond the control of the company. In fact, most miners lived in company housing prior to that. And this tent colony at Ludlow, which was the largest, housed about 1,200 striking miners and their families. And if they thought they could hold out long enough, the coal supplies to bustling, urbanizing Denver might shrink and force the Colorado governor to intervene on their behalf. United Mine Workers ranks swelled in the Colorado coal fields in 1913, prompting Colorado Fuel and Iron owner John D. Rockefeller Jr., his father being the oil tycoon from the century previous. He'd assumed control of Colorado Fuel and Iron in 1907. He attempted to counter the union's appeal. He instituted a 10% pay increase, an 8-hour workday, the abolition of script, which was company store credit that trapped miners in debt to the company, and the provision of unionized check weighmen, as they were called, to ensure fair payment for coal loads. These were the people that weighed miners' loads of coal to pay them. As it turns out, Rockefeller sounds benevolent. It really just brought him in line with Colorado labor law. So many miners didn't see this as quite the gift that Rockefeller claimed he was giving them. All right, with decidedly less fanfare than his announcement of all these glorious things that he was giving to miners, he hired the Baldwin Phelps Detective Agency. This is a notorious anti-union mercenary company that had recently machine gunned striking miners in West Virginia. He had the local sheriff deputize 300 of them. Despite skirmishes, a tense standoff between these agents of the coal company and the union, this until April of 1914, when on the morning of April 20th, some of these militiamen on contract with Colorado Fuel and Iron demanded that one of the strike leaders, the Greek-born Louis Tikas, turn over a captive allegedly held at the miners' camp at Ludlow. Tensions spun out of control. Rifle and machine gun volleys ensued. And by the afternoon, White City, Tent City, where all of these miners and their families lived, was ablaze. Dozens of people were trapped in the dirt cellars below the burning tents. 4 women and 11 children died in the inferno. Militiamen shot Tikas and other organizers in the backs. Here's his body after all of this violence. All told, 18 miners died in what became known among labor sympathizers as the Ludlow Massacre. This is enshrined in the great Woody Guthrie song. Should have played that for the talk. As the American Federation of Labor put it in late 1914, quote, the militia, in these detective agency hires, has acted with the most brutal and wanton license, committing with impunity numerous crimes from murder of women and children down to petty larceny, end quote. Over the next week, miners struck back. They dynamited, looted, burned, otherwise destroyed at least half a dozen mines. And by the time the financially strapped United Mine Workers gave up the strike in December of 1914, 66 miners or family members had died in the violence. There was a federal commission charged with investigating what had happened in the Colorado coal fields. Ultimately, they were unwilling to press Colorado, the government, state government, to bring criminal charges against Colorado Fuel and Iron and its agents, really intensifying suspicions among mine workers that the government, whether it be the federal or the state government, more often than not sided with capital over labor. The Ludlow massacre demonstrates the degree to which carbon, energy, in this case coal, had become central to the struggles between capital and labor by the early 20th century. And these struggles would only intensify in the coming decades as the imperial powers of the world, including the United States, but also Britain and France and Germany, modernized their militaries with the latest carbon-fueled weapons of war, as more cities and regions electrified, and as the personal automobile class existence in some parts of the industrialized world. So I want to turn our attention, I'm going to fast forward now to the 1990s, get us a little closer to our present. And I want to shift our geographic attention away from North America to West Africa. So this is our second example, taking us to the Niger River Delta in the early 1990s. The West African country of Nigeria, by this time, emerged in the last quarter of the 20th century as what we could call a petrostate, similar to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and other places like Venezuela, dependent primarily on oil exports for basic operations. In 1992, oil from the Niger River Delta made up a fourth of Nigeria's GDP. 15 years later, it was half, with 80% of government revenues derived from oil. Going back to the 1960s, Nigeria's civil war that began in 1967, the military generals in power in the capital city of Lagos implemented partial nationalization of Nigeria's oil industry. They did this in 1969, and in 1971 established the Nigerian National Oil Company to handle the marketing and distribution of Niger River Delta oil. I'm going to build us back up to the 1990s and talk a little bit about how Nigerian oil intersected with Nigerian politics in the 1970s and 80s, particularly Nigeria's relation with large international financial institutions. Soon after the Nigerian Civil War and the establishment of the Nigerian National Oil Company, world oil prices soared as a result of the energy crisis of 1973 and 74. Nigeria's oil production had been dominated by a joint venture between Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, based in Britain, and British Petroleum since the 1950s. Its production ballooned to over 2 million barrels a day, in part to fill the void coming out of the Middle East and some of the members of exporting countries. In short, the central government in Nigeria, which was once quite impoverished and enthralled to British colonial interest, now had a lot of money. And real economic independence seemed within reach for this new nation. The country began to absorb these windfall revenues from oil over the course of the 1970s. And control over the oil fields thus became critical to anyone with political aspirations in Nigeria. In 1975, the military regime that was currently in power at the time issued something called Decree 6, which increased the central government's share of oil revenues from 50%, and the other 50% was going to the states. There were 12 states at the time, to 80%, right? Centralizing oil revenues with the military regime. It left the country's 12 states with 20% to divide among themselves. And so we can already see by this time, early in Nigeria's independent history, a struggle over how oil revenues would be distributed and what kinds of projects they might fund. Would they be local? Would they be national? Who would benefit? This will be important when we get to the 90s and think about some of the protests that emerge against primarily Shell and its operations in Nigeria. What happened in the 70s, though, is that a series of military generals began distributing oil revenues to themselves, of course, and their families, their oligarchic partners, often at the expense of locals in the Niger River Delta, which was Nigeria's primary oil-producing region. With all of this money derived from oil flowing into the national government's coffers, temptations for corruption, as we might expect or imagine, abounded. The personal bank accounts of these military generals swelled to obscene levels. Repeated development plans in the 1970s and into the 1980s called for massive investments of the oil revenues in healthcare, education, roads and bridges, agriculture, and other kinds of public interest projects. Few of those things materialized. The 1980s were not much better. Add to the problem of corruption derived from the oil revenues was the government's ballooning foreign debt. One military general, Muhammadu Buhari, assumed power in 1983, and his government carried over $16 billion in debt from his predecessor, the centerpiece of which was a $480 million deal with British Aerospace for a fleet of 18 Jaguar ground attack fighters. These are the kinds of things that the oil revenues were invested in. This was not simply for national defense of Nigeria against potentially aggressive regional neighbors, but increasingly deployed against any resistance among Nigerian citizens who dared to challenge its authority. Other kinds of external pressures abounded too. In 1986, for example, Newswatch, which was Nigeria's premier English language newspaper, revealed that not only was 20% of Nigeria's oil being smuggled out of the country illegally by militia groups and members of the National Army and Navy, Western creditors were often demanding repayments of debts that were a result of fraud schemes involving Nigerian government officials, bankers in Britain and Asia, and the International Monetary Fund. In other words, by the 1980s, the problem of debt, the problem of corruption, meant that ordinary citizens in Nigeria were at an extreme disadvantage in terms of their relationship to the oil that was supposed to lift Nigeria out of economic dependence, foreign dependence in particular. I'm gonna skip ahead here in my remarks for just a bit so we can get to the real action. Poverty had elevated by 1990 to obscene levels, in particular in the oil region of the Niger River Delta. And one ethnic group there, known as the Ogoni, formed under the leadership of a man named Kensar Owiwa. I'm gonna put his image up here. Formed the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people. And shortly after issued the Ogoni Bill of Rights. This was a mass movement against the collusion between Shell and BP, the International Monetary Fund, and the Nigerian government that had kept the Ogoni and other ethnic groups in the region increasingly in debt, impoverished, and living in an environmental calamity given Shell and BP's lack of attention to the ecology of the area where they extracted oil. This Ogoni Bill of Rights, a really remarkable document for its clarity and its attention to historical injustices wrought by the oil company and the military government. I want to quote from it for just a minute. I think it's worth hearing the words of this group. We, the Ogoni, the people of Ogoni, numbering about 500,000, being a separate and distinct ethnic nationality within the Federal Republic of Nigeria, wish to draw the attention of the governments and people of Nigeria to the undermentioned facts that in over 30 years of oil mining, the Ogoni nationality have provided the Nigerian nation with a total revenue estimated at over 40 billion naira, or $30 billion. That in return for the above contribution, the Ogoni people have received nothing. This was in all caps in the document. That today, the Ogoni people have no representation whatsoever in all institutions of the federal government of Nigeria. No pipe-borne water, no electricity, no job opportunities for the citizens in federal, state, public sector, or private sector companies, no social or economic project of the federal government, that the search for oil has caused severe land and food shortages in Ogoni, one of the most dense, neglectful environmental pollution laws and substandard inspection techniques of the federal authorities have led to the complete degradation of the Ogoni environment, turning our homeland into an ecological disaster. End quote. Ken Saro-Wiwa, here pictured here, was confident in the rule of law, but he also knew that he was up against the two most repressive forces in his country, the military government and the oil company. And in November 1992, MOSOP, the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, issued an ultimatum to Shell and to the government. They either pay back rents and royalties for the harm they've caused and the money they've stolen, and compensate them for land devastated by oil exploration and production, or leave. The companies ignored the demand. And in response, MOSOP leaders organized a massive grassroots resistance campaign, fundraising, speaking tours, street protests, election boycotts, pipeline sabotage, a public relations campaign. The independent press garnered widespread sympathy for the Ogoni struggle at home and abroad. And for a brief time in 1993, Shell suspended its operations in Ogoni. But soon they returned and began surveilling MOSOP leaders. In May of 1993, the government issued the Treason and Treasonable Offenses Decree, which made secession, which the Ogoni were calling for, punishable by death. In fact, the Ogoni were not calling for secession, they were calling for ethnic self-determination. But of course, the government conflated the two things. Later that year, private security forces on the payroll of Shell, similar to those Baldwin Felts detectives in the pay of Colorado Fuel and Iron, moved into Ogoni villages committing systematic massacres. Over 1,000 Ogoni were killed, and 20,000 were made refugees in the first 2 weeks of September 1993 alone. The conspirators blamed a nearby ethnic group. And in the midst of the assault on Ogoni, Shell and the military government conspired to assassinate prominent members of a local council of chiefs and elders. And after they carried out the killings, they moved through Ogoni, rooted out Ken Saro-Wiwa and the other MOSOP leaders, and framed them for the assassinations, arrested them. Writing from prison to an Irish comrade, Saro-Wiwa said, quote, "Shell are finally succeeding, it would appear, in shutting me up, but that will surely not be the end of the matter," end quote. After the arrests, Shell Nigeria's chief executive named Brian Anderson arranged private meetings in May and June of 1995 with Ken Saro-Wiwa in Lagos. The Ogoni boycotts and protests against Shell's environmental and human rights abuses. And in exchange, Anderson would pressure the military government to drop the murder charges. Saro-Wiwa refused. Following a sham military tribunal, The Ogoni Nine, as they became known, which included Saro-Wiwa, it's an image of them at this trial, were hanged on November 10th, 1995. During the execution, anti-riot police cordoned off the prison, allowing no protests near the site, and they were buried in an unmarked grave. International condemnation was, shall we say, lackluster. Western nations implemented meager restrictions on travel and the sale of military hardware to the Nigerian government, but an oil embargo or asset seizure, many of these military officials were, had all of their money stashed overseas, never materialized, and no international criminal proceedings followed either. The Ogoni struggle is instructive on several key points about the politics of oil in the last quarter of the 20th century, and I would argue remains true today. First, it demonstrates the degree to which oil revenues tend to corrupt the institutions of states and nations, that it becomes very easy for state officials to develop relationships with oil companies in ways that are threatening to not only the environment, but also to populations that live in these areas. Second, though, the Ogoni uprising did have some intermittent success. In 1993, Shell abandoned the territory briefly. In 1995, it seems that Shell was willing to negotiate with Saro-Wiwa, not because they were nice, but because they saw the power of the Ogoni movement. And ultimately, those negotiations didn't happen, and Saro-Wiwa held steadfast to his convictions. But the intention was that Shell was sufficiently worried about the potential international blowback about its treatment of the Ogoni that it was willing to do these negotiations. The third, and I'll wrap up. The Ogoni experience reveals the degree to which international energy companies were and are, as we've seen with indigenous groups in the US and Canada, willing to deploy violence against local populations who stand in their way. While the circumstances and potential outcomes of today's ongoing indigenous-led battles against pipelines in North America may differ in degree from the Ogoni, a study of the historical record of carbon energy production suggests that they share much in common. The possibility of collusion and corruption, disregard for indigenous rights and voices, little, if any, regard for short and long-term environmental consequences. The Niger River Delta is today one of the most polluted places on Earth. The damage done in the 90s continued into the 21st century. The footage just from this year is of an oil-soaked wetland where fish and other animals struggle to survive, and populations of people that rely on fishing for their basic food needs and income struggle with poverty and hunger. The Ojibwe in northern Minnesota, the Unisautin in British Columbia, are struggling to prevent a similar fate on their homelands. These water protectors know their history. Let us all do our part to learn it too, for a more just future. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to open it up for questions now. Do we have I left us enough time for that? Okay, great. All right, thank you. Yes.
I'm not really sure. Number one, I'm a little unsure.
Probably has something to do with it.
That takes us, but also, I have a question about both the First Nations and the indigenous people in Minnesota. So on that map that you showed, has this pipeline made it and south, despite all of the input from and US?
Which pipeline? The Line 3 pipeline? So the Line 3 pipeline runs from the tar sands in Alberta to Superior, Wisconsin, as an export terminal.
But what about the east, western, eastern, Weaver people?
Sure. Oh, yeah. So the question, sorry, forgot we're on Zoom too. Yeah, the question was particularly the ones in British Columbia and the sort of status of those at the moment. I am not, there's so many of them, like the Unisotan, as I said, were combating at one point in 2015 or so, at least 10 proposed pipelines through their territory alone, representing multiple energy companies, partnerships with energy companies in China, Korea, Japan. Some of these were tar sands pipelines, some were liquid natural gas pipelines, fracked gas pipelines. I don't know which ones are operational and which ones are not. I do know that some of the main ones that I think one of the Enbridge pipelines that the Unisotan were actively blockading. As late as 2020, the project had not proceeded, but in, I think, February of 2020 or so, the Canadian Royal Mounted Police came in and cleared the resistance camp. And so I'm not sure the status of that one, where it is in construction. And I mean, your concern about your own naivete about this is like, there's so many of these projects that it's hard to keep track of them, right? So you shouldn't feel bad about that. Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Sponholz.
Yeah, I have a question about, it seems to me that some of the most important politics of pipelines in the world have to do with pipelines that go from the Middle East to Europe. Because the United States produces a lot of its own oil. And
Yep. Yep.
But you haven't said anything about any resistance anywhere between those areas. Can you, I mean, we never talked about it, but can you talk about that at all? Do you know anything about that?
A little bit. So the question was about a similar pipeline resistance along routes carrying oil from the Middle East and Russia to Europe. And so suffice it to say that after World War II, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Iran in particular become major suppliers of oil, not to the United States, which is what we assume, but to Europe. And that would continue for much of the rest of the 20th century. When the Soviet Union collapses in the very late 1980s and into the 1990s, a lot of that oil becomes sort of available, right, to markets outside the Soviet Union. And what we see is that many of these Western energy companies, but others, including American companies, sort of get in on the Russian game and develop relationships with new national governments in places like Azerbaijan, the Republic of Georgia, to build these pipelines as well. The resistance, excuse me, the resistance to these is made more problematic than perhaps First Nations and Indigenous communities in the US and Canada because of the nature of the governments of those countries, including the nature of the governments of Iraq and Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia is a complete dictatorship. And so resistance within sort of a democratic framework looks a lot different, shall we say, than the kinds of resistance that come out of those areas. It's probably also complicated by the fact that standards of living in a place like Saudi Arabia have been funded on the back of oil, and to what degree there's a sort of environmental movement that's attempting to counter that. I don't know the answer to that, honestly, or the scale of what that looks like.
I was actually thinking of places like Poland or Turkey.
Oh.
For instance, like places where there might be anti-Western and anti-Western sentiment.
In places like Poland and Turkey, yeah, I'm not sure. And a lot of those pipelines are mostly connecting former Soviet areas to Western Europe. I would have to imagine that there's sort of similar groundswells of resistance. The scale of it, the visibility of it, it's hard. I'd like to say that it's like, you know, gaining momentum. I just don't know the answer. Yes.
How do you see the role of the media?
Question was, how do you see the role of the media in all of this? I'll say that there's some really good independent media that gives some very good attention to these matters. I will say that the corporate media, it gives almost none. And that goes for climate change more broadly. Whenever they're covering wildfires or floods, there's hardly ever a mention of the link to climate change. And if they're covering, you know, an oil spill or something like that, like probably the amount of attention is relative to the size of the spill and the inability, you know, the ability or inability to just avoid it. That's my general take on that. Sorry.
No, I was thinking that in terms of these pieces that we've never heard of.
Yeah.
Part of it is the media doesn't talk about it.
It's true. There's some great grassroots organizations that really have their own media arm. And I think one of the, you know, I have a lot of problems with social media, but one of the great things about it is that it has the potential to democratize these kinds of stories. And in fact, some of the pictures that I showed you earlier of pipeline protests came off of, you know, Honor the Earth's Instagram page, right? It's like they have their own sort of media arm that can sort of bring these stories to light, advertise them. And then, as I said, there's some great independent outlets that are picking these up. And, you know, I've been going to those independent outlets for a long time now. I haven't watched CNN in I don't know how long.
How would you compare that then to, say, the events happening in Ludlow?
So comparing,
Media-wise.
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so the comparison between Ludlow over 100 years ago and today, in terms of you know, the circumstances of the protests are different, but you know, there's I would say, at least within the American press at that time, there are limited options in terms of, you know, where you can get your media. I mean, we're talking about newspapers most. So there's, you know, there's regional layers to this, like how national the Ludlow massacre was. It's hard, I haven't looked to see that, but certainly like the American Federation of Labor and labor unions which also had, media arms, news arms of their organizations were broadcasting these things widely. And this was not the high point of the American labor movement, but it's sort of gaining momentum. And so I think it'd be hard to sort of equate the two, but certainly there's a responsibility, right, of media outlets with integrity to cover these kinds of things. Yes.
Give me updates on the Ogoni people now. I know you talked about damage that was done there.
Yeah.
25 years since the sovereignty was there. Even on the bill.
The question was update on the Ogoni. No self-determination yet, but MOSOP is still around. And some of the leaders of MOSOP today are the children of the leaders from the 90s. And many of the things that they are engaged in at this point are through legal channels to try to get restitution for the environmental damage. Shell agreed, I think it was in 2014, to clean up the region and to invest all this money in the cleanup. And it's, it's been bogged down in bureaucracy and waste, and it hasn't happened yet. And so there's still, it's still a struggle. Like the military government's not murdering leaders of MOSOP as far as I know, but and Shell isn't operating there, at least at the scale that they were, but there's no sort of environmental or economic restitution of any serious kind yet. There's been some small payments, but they're pretty meager. Okay, were there any questions from Zoom? Okay. All right, well, I want to thank everybody again, and thanks to Dulcie for having me. It's great.
Well, thank you all again for joining us for the second installment of How It's Going, How It Started. Please plan to join us again in January. We're taking a couple months off because, November and December get awfully busy, but we will be back January 18th, same place, same time, and we will have Dr. Ken Fonts, who is in the audience with us this evening, talking about globalization and drug trade. Great. Thank you again so much to Dr. Clif Stratton for being here. Thanks again to the Kenworthy staff and volunteers and the Idaho Humanities Council for their support. We do have some information in the lobby about the Latah County Historical Society if you have questions. And also thanks to our friends from the Citizen Climate Lobby who also have a table in the lobby if you would like to learn a little bit more about their organization. So everybody have a great evening and a great Friday.